Frank White, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, I'm very, very thankful that you've come on. We're on episode 95 now, and you've been on my radar since episode 1. So as we get to the 100th episode, it seems fitting to get people like yourself on. So thank you for coming
Oh,
on.
thank you. Yeah.
Um, Listeners of the podcast, they will have heard me talk about the overview effect quite a lot. I probably talk about it too much, and it probably gets a bit annoying. And that's your fault. so, uh,
Yeah,
so
I get it.
let's start with the term the overview effect. Do you have a succinct definition for it, or if someone asks you what is the overview effect, how do you respond?
Yeah, so the succinct definition is that it's an experience astronauts, cosmonauts, space travelers have when they see the Earth from space and in space. So they see the Earth from space, that is, orbiting or going to the moon or a suborbital hop. But also, it's pretty important to note that they see the Earth against the backdrop of the cosmos. So they're not only seeing the Earth differently, they see the universe differently. And that's the current definition. But I would also add that it didn't start that way. The original theory, if you will, was about people who lived permanently off the planet. And in 1984 or thereabouts, when I had the experience that led to the overview effect as a phenomenon, there were no such people. And so I have really been interviewing astronauts as proxies for future space people. And we can get into the difference between the two hypotheses, if you will, but that's the short version.
Hmm. It's really interesting, and I guess it's you're very much the overview effect. It describes a really subjective thing, so it means different things to different people from different backgrounds,
Yeah.
different world experiences. Let's start with the astronauts, because obviously that's these are the people who have experienced the overview effect, and there's only been whatever it is 600 odd astronauts,
Yeah.
including recent space tourism, space tourists who are also astronauts.
Yeah.
But with more traditional astronauts, the Apollo program and the shuttle era, what were some of the most surprising or profound insights they shared about their experiences in space when you interviewed them over the years?
Well, certainly a common experience is the looking at the Earth and seeing no borders and boundaries. And almost every astronaut brings it up, and it's almost always in the context of, well, I actually knew that from school. I knew there were no borders or boundaries, and that the borders and boundaries are conceptual, really. But there's something about the experience of it that is really grabbing and impactful. And that's an important idea. One of the astronauts brought it up to me that there's a huge difference between intellectual or conceptual experience and experiential experience. So the overview effect is first and foremost an experience, and you can write about it, you can talk about it, you can make films about it, but you won't fully understand it till you experience it in some way. That's one thing. I think the other interesting aspect that is emphasized over and over again is the thin blue line of the atmosphere. Again, this is kind of a distinction between conceptual and experiential understanding. Jeff Hoffman talks about it. He talks about you look up into the sky and it's blue and it seems to go on forever and ever. When you're in orbit, you look at it and the atmosphere is just incredibly thin. uh, little envelope that protects us and keeps us alive. There's also kind of a distinction or conclusion that people draw, which is the interconnectedness of it all. And we're all in it together, and we tend to focus on our differences. But astronauts come back and say those are really minor compared to what unites us. We're all human. We're all earthlings, as Nicole Stott would say. We're all on a little spaceship that's crashing around the universe, and we need to get that we're all in this together. That might be the most important part because, again, that's not how we see the world when we're on the surface. We don't see it that we're all in this together. We see it as competitive. The I'm an American, you're British, so and so is Chinese, so and so is Russian, and we don't see the common humanity enough. And so that's a profound part of it. And I would close with one thing that's really been emerging lately, and that is the emotional impact. Astronauts are now willing to tell me that they cried when they saw the Earth for the first time, or they cried on the way home after their flight. It's an emotional reality, and I suppose maybe this is a good analogy, and I don't know how to make an analogy, but let's say you'd never met your mother, or you'd never really seen your mother, and the first time you met her or saw her, you might be overwhelmed with emotion. And that's probably not a great analogy, but again, there's something very, very moving about seeing the earth in that way.
Completely. It's a really powerful experience, which sort of
It is.
transcends a normal day to day life. I haven't taken Class A drugs, but I imagine it's almost like a sort of psychedelic experience where
Right.
sort of transcends the day
Right.
to day, which is very interesting. And
That's a
and
good
how
point. Yeah.
I was just
And
wondering how many people uh how many people feel the differences in the overview effects? Because you talked about the commonalities, so not seeing the borders, the thin blue line.
yeah,
Have you observed any commonalities or differences in the way astronauts from different cultures
yeah.
uh, and backgrounds experience the overview effect?
There are differences because one of the realities that I came to understand when I was beginning my research is that it's kind of like experiential versus intellectual knowledge. Astronauts are not robots. They are not androids. They are people. They are human. And so you and I could go to the Grand Canyon, for example, which is an analogy that's used a lot, and we could come back. We could have really had, quote unquote, the same experience, but we would talk about it differently because we're different, you know? So there are these differences. And I think, William Shatner is an example of a difference that it still has a lot of the commonalities, but Shatner came out of the Blue Origin capsule and he was really, really overwhelmed in a way very few people are. And he contrasted the blackness of space with the blue of Earth, and he analogized it to death and life. That's different. And a lot of writers wrote about it and said, "Oh, everybody thinks the overview effect is a positive experience, but William Shatner had a negative experience." Well, no, that's not exactly right. He was talking about the devastation humanity is creating on Earth and realizing this is all we've got. There's nothing else but this. A lot of astronauts have brought that up. They've been terribly moved and concerned about what they see humans doing to the earth, but the level of it is different for sure. Another difference is something I've called, uh, I would almost call it the overview effect plus, or I've called it in my book, the universal insight. There's a way of seeing the planet and experiencing everything I just told you about and realizing unity and oneness of the planet. But if you have the universal insight, it's kind of like you become one with the universe. It's really like a spiritual experience. And Edgar Mitchell had that kind of experience. And he's not one to use the word spiritual, but he went around after he came back because he had a very, very profound experience. And he told a lot of different experts, this is what happened. What was it? What's the name of it? And somebody told him it was samadhi. And samadhi is definitely a spiritual experience. It's enlightenment or similar, close to enlightenment. And part of the reason is, Mitchell was always, even though he's trained as a scientist and as a test pilot, all of that, he also was always interested in philosophy and spiritual matters, even though he, being a scientist, liked to talk about consciousness, not spirituality. And and Shatner's an actor, and definitely not a professional astronaut. I don't think he had any idea what he was getting into when he flew. So there's this whole question of how open are people to it. Some people are overly prepared, I think. And so I could go on, but you can see there are similarities and there are differences. And hooray for that. I would be unhappy if everybody came back and said the same thing, because that would not be, to me, as interesting as the fact that they describe it differently. Even though it's the same experience, they describe it differently.
Absolutely. Well, we talk about William Shatner's flight, and I spoke to Dr. Chris Boscheisen on the podcast
Yeah,
many moons ago, about a year ago,
yeah.
and he talked about how he experienced the outer view effect. As a
Oh,
sort of
yeah,
slight
yeah.
twist on your term. So the looking out into the cosmos and feeling that urge to explore, which is
Yeah,
just as inspiring. I hadn't heard that term before. Um, what's
yeah,
your thoughts on that? How what's the difference between looking back at
yeah.
Earth, back on Earth, and feeling our insignificance and the fragility of Mother Earth,
Mm.
and looking out into the cosmos? And it's a lot to feel both those feelings at the same time.
When I interviewed Chris, he said, I think I was really prepared to see the Earth without borders and boundaries because it was part of my work with my company to look at a lot of pictures of the Earth. And he said, to me, he said, what I wasn't prepared for was this feeling almost of a force pulling me outward, out into the universe. And that is different. And that was another difference I was going to bring up. And I think you're exactly right. And it's a fascinating topic to discuss because it's really not something that's been understood. But many astronauts have told me they felt very comfortable there, didn't want to come back. People talk kind of jokingly that it's in our DNA to go. But there has been research that 20% of the population does have an explorer gene. And that 20% may not want to go to outer space. They may want to, it's people who tend to take risks and explore in various ways. So they might become a medical researcher, a race car driver, any number of outcomes depending on the society they're in. So if society allows the expression of this gene, it may manifest in the kind of thing Chris experienced. But it's remarkable to think about the environment you're in is dangerous and potentially fatal. And you're on the International Space Station, let's say, and if you wanted to walk outside, you'd be dead, you know? But why is it? What is it that causes astronauts to say, I felt really at home and I want to go back? And, Jeff Bezos talked about weightlessness and how natural it felt. And a lot of
Mm.
astronauts talk about that. It's a very strange experience, and yet they quickly become accustomed to it. And it's one of the reasons I strongly feel that space exploration and even what interests me these days, space migration, will happen. I do believe that people are drawn to this type of activity, and it may be in their DNA. But it does seem to be more than just a passing fancy of some people. It just seems to be really important to some folks to explore and in a way to explore the most extreme environments.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, you're right. It is a dangerous environment, but I can make the point that driving a car, you're likely to die. You're driving a 3-ton vehicle at 100 miles an hour or less, and 100 years ago that was seen as high risk, and you'd be mad to do that. So it's all very much sort of
Yeah.
subjective to the time. In the near future, obviously, not everyone is going to be able to afford a ticket to low Earth orbit. But do you think there's a potential for using technology such as VR headsets to bring
Yeah.
potentially not the full overview effect, but maybe? I mean, I've seen some pretty good demos of pretty indistinguishable. Um, I won't name any particular brands, but sort of headpieces where you can
Yeah.
see and feel what it's like. Do you think there's an opportunity there to sort of bring the overview effect to the masses, maybe in schools and to people where areas of the world where space might not be accessible yet?
I strongly support that because we really can do that without much harm to the environment. We have to be careful with space flight, and we've got to really improve on protecting the environment when we launch rockets into orbit or suborbital flight. On the other hand, virtual reality doesn't have that problem. And I've seen quite a few and experienced quite a few overview effect experiences in VR that impress me very, very much. And, there's also one that was done in conjunction with NASA that's unique, and that is called the Infinite. And these guys who created it sent cameras to the ISS. And apparently, you put on the headset, but you go into a big warehouse kind of environment. And people who come out just are really overwhelmed. And again, some of them are in tears from the experience.
Mm.
So, yes, I think it's going to be possible to come close to the real experience with other technologies.
Mm. Are there any specific psychological or cognitive processes that underlie the overview effects that you find particularly fascinating or worthy of further exploration? Because it is such a new
Mm.
area of psychology. Where do you, obviously it starts with the data. There isn't a huge amount of data, and that's only going to improve
Mhm.
over time. But what specific processes do you
Well,
think are behind that sort of inane desire to explore?
yeah.
What's your recent thoughts on that?
Well, I believe it's a survival mechanism when you talk about exploration. And again, extend it to migration. It's pretty clear that humans have migrated and explored since Homo sapiens appeared. The best guess is that all of our ancestors started in Africa and began to migrate out at a certain point. And even today, the response to external situations means that people are exploring now and migrating now. What's the difference? Exploration is when you go out and you go to an unknown place you've never been before, you experience it for whatever reason, and you come home. That's exploration, right? Migration means you go somewhere else to stay. And we see that every day on planet Earth. And I think that a lot of it is a response to external situations. For example, in the United States, we have people crossing the southern border every day. And in most cases, there are two reasons. One, they're looking for opportunity they can't get at home. And two, it's dangerous at home. And so, or they can't really survive economically at home. And I think that's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that you see a more attractive place over there, or the place where you are is becoming incredibly unattractive. And so if we didn't migrate in the past, I think we could have become extinct. Also, there have been 5 major extinctions on this planet. This planet has not always been the nice, friendly, lovely place it is today. And so, there may be a sense among some people, even today, that there's a need to move on. There's a need to find new territory. Uh, and I would argue, I know we're toward the end of our time, but I would argue that migration of humans and industry off of planet Earth could benefit the Earth because we're putting a terrible toll. We're having a terrible toll on the carrying capacity environment of the Earth. It really wasn't created to support this incredible technological civilization we've created. So we're demanding an awful lot of Mother Earth, and I think the Earth's a little bit like the mom again, who has the son living in the basement, and he's old enough to go out and take care of himself and get a job. And mom loves him, but she kind of wishes he'd migrate. I think I think Homo sapiens is a bit like that.
No, sure. And I completely agree that kind of grass is always greener has always applied, well, nearly always applied on Earth. A lot
Yeah,
of people dream of living in other countries, but obviously
yeah,
that changes when, you're talking about somewhere like Mars, a barren wasteland where it's going to be pretty
yeah,
awful for the first few decades at least. I
yeah,
mean, that is a big question,
yeah,
where would the migration start? I mean, it sounds like you're very sustainability minded, and the sort of Jeff
yeah.
Bezos thinking of making Earth greener and heavy manufacturing in Earth, the
Right.
Blue Origin vision. Do you think the migration will be to low Earth orbit in the short term, and then the moon, and then further out, or can it all happen at once at various
Well,
streams?
I'm a follower of Gerard K. O'Neill, and I believe Jeff Bezos is as well. And O'Neill's vision was of creating Earth-like environments at the Lagrangian points between the Earth and the Moon. And the whole idea there was you would create Earth-like environments. And much of what we worry about in leaving the planet has to do with the change in gravity and the radiation hazards and how do you grow food and all of that. And O'Neill worked all of that out many years ago. So I believe that there will be people going to the moon and Mars because that's so obvious. However, I think the moon and Mars can only support a very tiny number of people. I really think we're going to have to do something like O'Neill's vision to have large numbers of people. But it's good to bear in mind that his vision was of communities close to the Earth. That's another benefit of that vision is uh, the moon is close, and that's a benefit of having habitats on the moon. Mars is tough. I mean, it's a long way. If you live there long enough, you might not be able to function on the Earth unless you do like the astronauts and exercise 2 hours a day. And, you know, unless Elon Musk can pull another rabbit out of the hat, it seems that there need to be stepping stones to Mars. I would love to see someone put in the effort to build one O'Neill community, just one, and see what's the cost, what's the effort. You'd have to use asteroid material to build it. Could we do it? Because I think it could change the conversation dramatically if we had one existing O'Neill community, because you have to imagine that whereas Moon and Mars are there, you don't have to build those particular human communities. They're there, and they're there to be built on if you can get there and survive.
For sure. You've obviously had a lot of contact with astronauts, more than pretty much anyone on Earth. If you were to go to space, what do you think your overview effect would be? I guess you've sort of you must have played your own mind games with this at various points, or do you think actually you've studied it so much? It would be, I can't remember which astronaut was it, but there was an astronaut that said he didn't feel anything, and that's just a personality thing. But what do you think your view on everything would be?
It's a really good question. I hadn't really put it in the realm of possibility till I was on a podcast with my friend Christina Rasmussen, and at the end she asked, "Well, do you want to go?" And I didn't know what to say because I had always seen myself as a person who interviews astronauts, not as an astronaut. So, first of all, one of the real obvious things is that my interviewing would change. Part of the reason my interviews with astronauts work well is that I'm like you, and I'm like the vast majority of people. I'm not experienced, and I'm not able to reproduce what they have gone through except by interviewing them. Once I've gone and come back, it'll be two astronauts talking to each other. It's a very different thing. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I really think it will depend on how well prepared I am and how much I can let go of expectations. That's going to be hard for me to do, you know? Yeah. I'm hopeful, though, because I'll tell you one thing. A colleague of mine, Jeremy Nickel, has created or did create a overview effect environment in virtual reality. And he invited me to go and experience it. And he gave me the impression it was a very early version, and it was not as good as he hoped it would become. And so I went, and I was really, really impressed. And I thought, wow, this is what the astronauts have been telling me about. So I had expectations. I had all the interviews, and yet I was impressed with it, you know. And
Mm.
yeah, and that experience has now been followed on by an artist named Shushu, who has built an overview effect experience in VR that is really very powerful. Again, um, and so that's one thing I would say is that going into VR has definitely had an impact on me.
Mm.
The other thing I would say is that it may not matter at all, how much experience I've had talking to astronauts. I talked to Gary Lee, who built, was the chief engineer for New Shepard, the Blue Origin flight. And in that interview, he told me about, the expectations he had because he was flying on a ship he had built, you
Yeah.
know. But he said that once the flight happened, something completely different took over. And the fact that he had built the ship became less important than the experience itself.
Mm.
So I don't think I'll feel nothing. And I I just don't know what I will feel. And yeah, but I'm working on my goal right now is to go on as many of the carriers as I can and then report back on how each one for me elicits the overview effect. So that'll be another piece of the puzzle for me.
For sure. And I think you play such a vital role in that, and the art and of storytelling and communicating. Without that piece, the overview effect, does not translate. It's all very
Right.
well for someone like Jeff Bezos to experience the overview effect, which I assume he has from what I've read. But if he doesn't change how he runs his companies and sees the Earth, it's kind of by the by, really. So what you do is so key to everything. For anyone listening who perhaps is intrigued by the overview effect and wants to bring it into their own lives. This could be on an individual level, or perhaps organizations looking to incorporate the principles of the overview effect. What would you, apart from read your book, which they probably have already, but I'll put the link in the show notes. What can people do? Because I always talk about sort of cosmic perspective and having a good look at the stars helps. But is there anything over and above that people can do to get some sense of perspective from Earth?
Well, in order to gain a better knowledge and experience of the overview effect, one thing I would suggest is this. NASA has created a series called Down to Earth, and it's got interviews with many astronauts. I started that by interviewing 7 astronauts in a studio and 3 on the ISS down at Johnson Space Center. And there are a lot of short interviews with astronauts, but then there's also an Emmy nominated documentary called The Astronaut's Perspective.
Mm.
And in addition to reading my book, and incidentally, there are 3 books, it's a trilogy uh, about the overview effect. So I would recommend reading every one of them once or twice, actually. Um, that'll give you a good idea of what's going on. But seriously, all my interviews with astronauts are in the overview effect. And so that's a good way. Now, if you're more of an activist, we have a nonprofit called the Human Space Program, which grew out of the research. And, you know, we have a movement called Bringing the Overview Effect Down to Earth. We are actively using the astronaut experience to see if we can shift consciousness on planet Earth. So you could definitely go to our website, which is just uh, thehumanspaceprogram.com, and you could get involved through HSP. We're doing quite a few projects, and that would involve people. And then there are other space advocacy organizations like the Beyond Earth Institute, the National Space Society, Space Frontier Foundation. There are many organizations working on the questions you and I have been discussing. So there are many ways to educate yourself, and there are many ways to also get directly involved and help shape the future. And we really need more people to help out, because right now, the evolution of humanity into the solar system is kind of a unplanned uh, scramble, if you will, of companies and countries. And the human space program is attempting to create a sustainable, ethical, and inclusive blueprint for human evolution into the ecosystem beyond. So there's a lot to do. And if you're interested in the topic and want to get involved in the most exciting adventure that humanity's known for many, many years, join us. We'd love to have people work with us.
That's fantastic. And wherever humans go in the solar system, I think the overview effect has got to be the backbone to that exploration, that humble look at the world and the solar system and realize that it all started from Earth. So
Yeah.
Frank White, it's been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you. Appreciate it, Ben.